Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome back to another show of From the Field, where we have a very special guest, Imran here, who works in the was it enterprise segment, I believe. Hopefully, I haven't
That's
got that wrong.
correct.
There's so
No,
many
you
of
got
us
that right.
joining. Yeah, I lose track. Like it's seeing new faces around all the time is the exciting time. So I am your host, KCO. I'm a solution architect located in Wellington, New Zealand. I do have to specify New Zealand part because there are apparently lots of Wellingtons around the world, and we need to be explicit on these things. But yeah, if unfortunately, like yeah, the sound quality for me will be slightly bad, so I do apologize for that up front. I am unfortunately in the office and I don't have my proper setup here, and I am also wearing a collared shirt, which is very unusual. So and I got my power squints on because being the ultra prepared man I am, I accidentally left my glasses up out in the main office. So hopefully this goes a lot better than how it started. And yeah, as I mean before, we're going to cover off IAM roles anywhere, which is a very interesting new feature that I believe came out about 3 or 4 months ago, if I am right on that.
Yep, that's correct. It came in June, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah, sweet. And it's a quite an interesting feature, and it really shows how we're starting to actually get into a lot more of that hybrid type ideology, and facilitate that type of approach going forward. Imran, do you want to do a quick introduction of yourself and really cover the what are we going to go over throughout this next 30, 40, 50 minutes?
Great. So hello everyone. My name is Imran Sadiq. So I'm a senior solutions architect in the enterprise segment, as Casey mentioned. So what we are here to talk about is IAM roles anywhere feature of IAM service itself. Now, I have been working with AWS for a while now, and managing IAM keys is always a big issue, and we always get issues with proliferation of those keys and a lot of compromised AWS accounts because the keys get shared where they shouldn't be or get put on GitHub where they shouldn't be. So we all been there. So this I thought would be a really good feature of the IAM service to talk about, as well as take you guys through a quick demo on how this works because it depends on certificate. So it's good to actually go through and show you how it works.
Have you had any customers or heard of any customers that you've actually walked this through, like actually implemented this?
Funny enough, I mean, I haven't really seen anyone go live with it as such, but as soon as it came out, I had presented it to a few customers, and then I got other essays requesting me to present and give a demo to their customers, because as I said, it seems to be quite an issue for a lot of organizations for managing those keys, and enterprises specifically are looking at ways how they can actually use their existing processes and better manage that access to AWS resources.
And I work in the SMB segment, so from the SMB, the smaller business side of things. Um, Even them, I've had a few customers reach out. Generally, they are in the regulatory space, so they have requirements to have that hybrid setup, where a lot of SMBs would tend to either have, either or setup.
Cool. All right. So shall we get started, Cassie?
Sounds good. Let's crack into it.
Awesome. All right. Let me share my screen.
This is where we have that awkward pause between it, where we wait for technology to do its thing. I can see the flicker on your side. There we go.
Great.
Looks like we're up and ready.
Awesome. All right. So before I get into the actual IAM roles anywhere feature of the service itself, I thought it would be a good idea to just get some of the basics correct and talk about the IAM service itself on what it is and what are the main terminology and features of IAM before we go deep dive into the IAM roles anywhere itself. So any of you I'm sure all of you guys have used IAM itself. So IAM is AWS's Identity and Access Management Web Service. It helps you securely control access to your AWS resources. Um, and you use that to control who is authenticated, means the users who sign in and authorized in terms of what permissions they have to access the actual resources themselves.
Yeah, IAM is a very deep and diverse subject, and I generally recommend that all customers have at least one developer or engineer that has the security certification, because it can get pretty intense.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, definitely, it's a really good idea to know this service very deep, at least have organizational knowledge, because you can be very powerful using this service in terms of what kind of permissions you can set up on your users as well as on your workloads in terms of how they access AWS resources. So IAM in a nutshell is who can access what. So in terms of who, it's normally the users, workforce users, or it can be the IAM roles themselves. In terms of who can access, that's just the permission policies that are set up in IAM, and what is the actual AWS resources that you access through there. So if we talk about some of the terminologies within IAM, talk about IAM roles. So IAM roles is very similar to a user. That is an AWS identity which you attach the permission policies to determine what resources they can or cannot access in AWS. But there's a clear distinction between the users and the roles. So unlike users, roles do not get any long-term credentials. So these are like passwords or access keys. Rather, they get temporary delegated access where they can use those credentials to access specific services and resources in AWS. Then we talk about policies and permissions. So you manage access to AWS resources using policies and then attaching them to IAM identities. As I mentioned, the identities can be the users, groups of users, or the roles, or AWS resources, which you which you can assign the policies, and they can assume roles to actually access other services within AWS. And policy itself is permission policy is just an object which when associated with an identity or resource, it defines the permissions on what they can access. And all these permissions and policies get evaluated when you actually go to make a request in AWS itself to access a resource or make a change. So access keys. Access keys are specifically created for IAM users. These are long-term credentials and they're used for accessing the resources, AWS resources from anywhere. And we see that being used in a lot of different ways. They can be used as part of the CI/CD pipelines for provisioning resources in AWS. They can be used from on-prem servers for accessing specific services, or they can be used by users from the CLI to access specific services in AWS as well. And that's where we were, Casey was talking about the hybrid nature of accessing AWS resources and access keys being the main way of doing that for a while now, to be honest. And alongside that, it does bring few drawbacks. So we'll talk about that in a little while around
And
that.
that has been improved through the use of those temporary tokens that you can continually renew. So if one does get leaked, then at least it's only valid for, 30 minutes or an hour. So there's been improvements along that front, but that's if anything that relies on a string for authentication, that ultimately is a weakness.
So, I mean, for example, if you have SSO set up, yeah, then you get those temporary credentials, which are only valid for a certain period of time, and they need to be renewed for you to actually keep accessing the resources. So just quickly talk about common use of IAM keys. What we've seen different organizations use these for is, for example, backing up their data. So mostly for backing up on-premise storage or from their machines into S3. So I know I've used to do that quite a bit. Very, very large files and archival documents that you would no longer need. You didn't really want to put them onto your old backup storage, which was used to be tape. So easiest way for that to be stored was in S3 or S3 Glacier, which is very, very cheap to do so. So in those cases, you would use IAM keys either with the software or directly from command line to actually back up the data in there.
The
Um,
So Imran, for the data backup one, it's also quite often when you have an account that is completely off to the side, or no one has access to. Quite often it's used for login retention or anything like that, which you don't want people to be able to delete or tamper with. So you really have an IAM role that's just allowed to write stuff to the new bucket, but it's not allowed to override or delete things.
Hmm. Yeah, I think what you're referring by Casey, if I got that correctly, is a bunker account we call it. So it's just
Yep.
a centralized account where you keep data for those unknown scenarios where someone might have access to other accounts and they could go and delete resources, but you want to have a bunker account that no one has access to. And I mean, S3 has this feature of called worm as well, which is write once and read many times. So you can use that to securing your data. The other use case is on-prem Kubernetes. So we see a lot of customers using that. Services running in on-prem Kubernetes may require access to DynamoDB, for example, or require access to SNS topics or different queues as well. So for those, the IAM keys are being used as well in the config to access those resources. Other one is secrets manager, access to secrets. I mean, managing secrets like IAM keys um, is is an organizational challenge. And there's a lot of products like HashiCorp Vault, for example, is being used by a lot of organizations. AWS has its own secrets manager, and I see a lot of organizations adopting to that. And again, for hybrid access, on-prem running services and workloads then need to access the secrets manager, and that's where one of the use cases is for IAM keys. And lastly is the hybrid workloads themselves. So these could be when you are going through a migration process and you moved some of your workloads in AWS, but you require access to those workloads from on-prem resources, and for that you would be then end up using IAM keys to access that. Cool. So that brings me to IAM Roles Anywhere. So IAM Roles Anywhere is a feature released by AWS, as Casey mentioned, about 3 months back. And what it allows you to do is an alternate way of accessing AWS resources from outside AWS compared to the keys. So just go through some of the basics of IAM Roles Anywhere. So some of the main concepts being introduced is a trust anchor. So the trust anchor is basically allows to establish a trust between IAM roles anywhere service and a certificate authority. Now the certificate authority can be AWS's ACM private CA service, or it could be your own on-prem CA setup, which you can import the certificate in. So basically, you're creating a trust between the IAM service and the certificate to say, hey, anything that is issued or any certificates issued by that certificate authority would be trusted by the IAM roles anywhere service. Second part of it is the roles. I mean, I already talked about what the roles are. So it's basically an IAM identity with specific permissions. So you need to define the roles when you're defining IAM roles anywhere, which can then be assumed by those external on-prem or users to access the AWS resources. And lastly is the profiles. Basically, profile defines which roles IAM roles anywhere can assume and what the workloads can do with the temporary credentials. So this is where things like the session policies come in, where you can define what those external workloads can actually access within AWS based on certain conditions. So that could be things like IP address, where you're coming from. So again, that's something that I will show in part of my demo, but something good to know. So these are the main components of roles anywhere.
To like make this like really, I guess like oversimplify it. So this would be allowing on-prem machines to use role-based access, similar to how attaching a IAM role to an EC2 instance.
That is exactly how it is. Yep, got that right.
Yay!
Nice. All right, so before we get into the actual demo itself, I thought I'll just take you through the steps on what happens when you are using IAM roles anywhere to access resources in AWS. So you see on the left-hand side, we have the external sources. So these could be laptops, devices, or could be on-prem services which have the certificates issued to them by a centralized certificate authority. Again, that could be the AWS's private CA, or it could be your existing enterprise CA itself. So the first thing happens is at the request to create a session using that certificate which is issued to the device is made to the IAM roles anywhere service. So IAM roles anywhere verifies the certificate validity against the predefined CA just to make sure that that certificate, which is the device presenting, is not been revoked or hasn't expired. Then IAM roles anywhere validates role to be assumed. So this is where it checks conditions to make sure that you are coming from the right IP address, for example, if you have defined that. And once that all is valid, it returns the source, external source temporary credentials. And then again, then temporary credentials can then be used to access the AWS resources as you would normally do. Cool. Well, that brings me to the demo. All right. So pray to the demo gods. It all goes well.
I think we've only had one demo so far go horribly wrong, so
Is it good then? All right. So I'm in the IAM role, IAM, Identity and Access Management Service. So in here, if you go to the roles on the left-hand side, Um, and if you scroll down, you would see a new section called Roles Anywhere. Click on Manage. Right, so I will get that started. So in here, if you can see, it says the first one is you need to establish the trust. So we talked about the trust anchor. So that's what you would need to be doing, creating the trust anchor. So either you can, as I mentioned, create a certificate authority within AWS using a private CA, or you can use your existing one. In my case, I already have created a private CS. If I open that up, I have this private CA already created in AWS, so I'll be using that.
Imran, do you, off the top of your head, this is a tool asking over, do you know the pricing, if there's any pricing associated with IAM anywhere?
No, there isn't any pricing with IAM roles anywhere. I guess there is pricing associated with obviously the private CA itself that you would be creating
Yep.
if you are
And
using AWS service.
I see in the release one it says no additional cost. But yeah, it seems like the cost will be in the private CAs.
Yeah, exactly. And as I said before, if an enterprise is using that and they already have a private CA on-prem and they're using that to issue certificates to their internal services, they can again use the same one. They don't need to create a new one here.
And
So the
how
first bit,
does,
sorry,
sorry,
go on.
how does X also mention the terrible fear from passing from PowerPoint to a demo? I know exactly what he's talking about, especially when it's live. It's like, oh God, please make sure this is all good.
Yeah. So, I mean, as you can see, it as being a new service feature, it takes you through step by step on how to create IAM roles anywhere and how to use that. So the step one is establishing trust, two is configuring the roles, and third is using the roles anywhere. So we'll create a trust anchor. I'll use this. So I call it IAM roles anywhere trust. As I mentioned before, I am using my own AWS created private CA, which is available here, or you can bring in your own certificate bundle from your existing private CA, which might be your personal one somewhere, or it could be AWS one. But for the ease of use, I'll just select that and I'll create the trust anchor. So the second part you need to do is create a profile that we talked about. And in here, you need to specify a role to be used with the profile. So basically, the role will define what permissions the external sources will have when they're using this profile to access resources in AWS. So I'll just go that. I will go to IAM and create the role first. So the first thing you need to do is provide the, I guess, which create the trust relationship between the role and the service that will be using it. So in this case, it will be IAM any roles anywhere. It's like any other role that you would create within AWS. And then the policy, the permissions that you want to assign to that role itself. So in our case, I will use an existing managed policy called S3 read-only access. So basically give access to our S3
For a second there, I
task.
thought you'd be just going straight to administrator
Oh yeah.
access. Yeah,
No,
it's just development. Just
just
give it
make it easy.
administer.
Go
Yeah.
for it. No, this is the interesting part over here, right? I will talk about that later on, or maybe I should just do it now. But let me create the role first. Maybe I'll come back to it. So the role has been created, and now if I go back to the screen where I was creating the profile, I can quickly select the role that I just created. And this is where I was talking about the session policies, right? So you can use an existing session policy or you can create your own one. And this is where you define things like the IP addressing so that the external sources are only allowed from that IP address. So it could be quite useful if you have your on-premise servers always using a certain number of public IP addresses, you can list them in here. So that just reduces the chance of anyone accessing this service from outside those outside your data center or on-premise servers where they're located. So another shield against protecting your AWS environment.
And we have one question that's just come through a little bit ago. Do you have to use a private CA for it to work, or can you use a public CA?
You can use a public CA, but I would, yeah, it'll be pretty difficult to have a public CA set up unless you have things like DigiCert, right? But it has to be a CA. It can't be a certificate, right? So there's a there's a difference between a certificate and a certificate authority. So it needs to be something which can actually issue certificate to the resources, which will then access the AWS resources using IAM roles anywhere, right? I hope that answers the question. But yeah, it can be any certificate authority. So if you're an organization which has access to a public CA that they use, yeah, go for it.
And Hardex also mentioned you'll need to have it onboard in Cert Manager. So yeah, you'd still have to have it in Cert Manager. So
Yeah, it doesn't need to be in Cert Manager itself. As I was showing you before, when you create the actual trust anchor, that's where you would go in and put the actual certificate bundle in there. So it's separate from the actual Cert Manager itself.
okay.
So it doesn't need to be in there. So great. So we got the profile created, we got the trust anchor, and now what I'm going to do is go and issue a certificate to myself for my machine so that I can access those resources using the roles anywhere. So I'll go request a certificate. So I'm requesting a private certificate using the private CA. So I will choose my existing private CA that I had created. So I have this somewhere before.
We can see all your notes, so it's not magic anymore.
Ah, damn it. I should hide this. So again, this is an additional benefit of using a private CA in AWS is that you can give it permissions to renew some of your certificates which are issued to AWS services, like a load balancer, for example, to automatically renew that, so you don't get into that horrible situation where the certificate is expired and then you're hunting down the person who issued it in the first place and all that. So this can take care of that for you.
As an infrastructure manager, that makes life so much easier because it's
Yeah.
nothing worse. Because about I think normally like a month beforehand you get an email and it's like this certificate's expiring, and you're like, where is that certificate actually being used?
Yeah.
And then you have to pretty much use some documentation that's always out of date because some developers use it to put on something else random. Ah, yeah, it's a nightmare.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is that these things don't happen on every day, right? So the validity for those private certificates is either a year or 2 years. So person who issued it last time might not even be in the organization, or even if they do,
Mm.
there might not be proper documentation in place to go and follow the same process. So yeah, I've seen it everywhere. Cool. So we have our certificate issued. So what I will do is I will export that out. It's pending validation. So just give it a couple of minutes. Yep, it's issued now. Green tick. So I'll go and export that out. So I will be exporting the private key as well. So I want to give it a password to protect it further.
A super secret, secure password, as always.
Yep, I'm not going to tell you what that is.
Damn it. Just give me your credit card number and bank ID. It's fine. We're among friends.
Sure. Right, so it's given me three things, right? One is the actual certificate body. The second is the certificate chain. So in this case, because we only have one CA, which is the root CA, so that's what this would be. And the third one is the actual certificate private key. So what I will now do is create all those in my directory. So uh, cert pen, so that's the certificate itself. I'll copy that here. Cool. And then the private key. Cool, that's all we need. One thing we do need to do is because I'm using CLI, I would need to have a copy of the private key which is um, doesn't have the password on it. Otherwise, my CLI won't be able to use it.
Oh, we can see your password now. Yeah.
Oh, oh, did I type that wrong? RSA, right? Okay.
I always get these command lines wrong. I remember when I'm trying to convert things from like PDX to like PEM or some crazy format, and I have
Yeah,
to read the documentation, and then I always
yeah.
forget to write down the actual process so I can copy and paste it next time. So I have to spend
Hmm.
30 minutes in a year's time doing it.
Cool. So once you have those information handy, so this is what you would be using in terms of if you are using CLI, for example, what you would be using to access or create your profile in your config file on command line to then be able to use that to access the resources. So we use something called a AWS signing helper. You can download that. It's just a small executable, and then you use the credential process, and in the credential process you would specify the certificate, which the body is shown there, the private key, which I downloaded, the trust anchor ARN, trust anchor that we created, the profile ARN, and the role ARN in there. So what I will do now is go ahead and create that. I actually have that already, so what I might do is just copy that.
While you're doing that, I'll just answer a question. So
Mhm.
this presentation will be up on Twitch for the next 90 days. We also have a From the Field YouTube channel that will archive this forever, so you can rewatch these presentations. If you want to get in contact with myself or the presenter, then we do have a LinkedIn group where you can just request to join and then post a question there, especially if you want one of these presentations that we're doing. We can PDF that and then send that through you. It's just Twitch is not a very easy way to share like emails and stuff like that, because obviously it's a public platform. So yeah, if you join this LinkedIn group, then you can reach out to myself either through LinkedIn directly or through that group, and yeah, we can definitely get the presentation or help or continue any further discussions or questions you have.
Great, thanks for that. So here I'll put my certificate itself and then the private key. Just make sure I get that right.
We're seeing this in real time.
Yeah, by now, right?
So you took a live demo seriously.
I did. So now that we created the ARNs, I will delete all these, the existing one that I was using for testing, and I will copy paste the new ones that we had just created. Cool. So that's the trust anchor ones. Go back in here. Yep, I've done that. So back to the roles anywhere screen, and as you've seen before, we created the trust anchor. So I'll go ahead and copy the ARN for it. Cool. And we need the profile ARN and the role ARN.
While you are going and doing this, I guess I would do some house cleaning as well. If you've just joined, we are going over the IAM Anywhere feature. It really allows you to have a role-based access between your on-prem servers or any other partners that you might have to AWS services. And the other one is I also have just posted a link earlier around the NZ technical community. We are in New Zealand, generally always looking for cloud experts, either AWS ourselves or our partners or the customers we support. We definitely always looking, it's a shortage in the market. So if you are watching from overseas and you think New Zealand's a pretty cool country, then feel free to apply or reach out to myself through that New Zealand AWS technical community, and then we can see what we can do to bring the dream of New Zealand to reality. I
Cool.
am shamelessly plugging New Zealand,
Great,
but
great plug there. Yeah. All right. So I'm going to copy the profile ARN now and paste that back in here. And lastly, we need the role ARN that is being used with that profile.
oh, where are you from? Outside the world, so I assume that would be North America or someplace, US or Canada. Like, Portugal. Oh, one of my the AMs I normally work with, he is from around there. So yeah, beautiful place. I kind of always wanted to go to Portugal. Rich history.
Me too. So I've just, as you can see, put all those values back in there. So the certificate, the private key, the trust anchor role, trust anchor ARN, the profile ARN, and the role that we just created to give us access to S3, read-only access. All right, so let's see if this works. Fingers crossed. So what I'm going to do is just very simple command of list all of my, play with this actually, S3 ls, list all of my S3 buckets.
Moment of truth.
If I got that profile name correct, that works. Oh, that's not the.
That's not what we want to say
I think it's
there.
just all IAM anywhere. Probably I need to just confirm that. IAM anywhere. Cool. So here we go. It works. So just to reiterate, it's not using any of the keys to access or to list all these buckets. It's using and the IAM roles anywhere credential process with those certificates, which has been issued to specifically me from the private CA, and then it uses that to actually, as I went through the process before, so maybe I should show that slide back in on how it works, which is, so yeah, the first step it is what we've done before. We got the certificate on the left-hand side on my laptop. I use that with with the access with the command s3ls that I used. IAM roles anywhere will check to validate that against the private CA which issued it. Then it'll confirm the role and any session policies that have been created for that profile. And if all that is correct, which is in our case it is, it will send back the temporary credentials to me, and then I will use the temporary credentials in our case to access the S3 buckets. Now, one thing I wanted to show or add it on now that we have a bit of time is how we can further control access in terms of the role itself. What you can do is you can use the C name for the certificates that you issued to further control access to which certificates or which sources can access what particular roles or what roles they can assume when they are using the IAM roles anywhere service. So as you see, we created this IAM roles anywhere S3 read-only access, which only has one policy, which is S3 access. But if you look at the trust relationship, basically it's telling us to allow roles anywhere service as a principal to assume or use that role. One thing we can do over here now is add a condition to this, which I have over here, and I'll explain what that is or what it would do. So basically what it is doing is when you use the roles anywhere and you're using the certificate, you pass in certain attributes to the roles anywhere service. And one of those things is the common name. You pass that in there. And in our case, common name is the on-prem server.octane.net nz. And to be sure, I can see if I can open this certificate over here. Oh, it's gonna open that. Doesn't matter. Okay, I'll ignore this for now. Don't need to go into too much detail. But if I look back into where the certificates were issued, right? So if I go to certificate manager, so this is a certificate that we just issued. And if you look at the details for that, you would say the name, the common name is on-prem server.octane.nz. So what I'm doing over here is only I, which have that particular certificate with a common name, will be able to access it. And this can be quite useful, not just in here. As you would have seen if you have checked our attribute-based access control mechanism, which allows you to reduce the complexity in your policies and in your roles, where we use a principal tags as a condition to allow access to certain sources. This could be a good way of doing that. So if you have a lot of servers that issue certificates to, you can use that principal tag to further then define the access to AWS sources. An example could be you have one S3 bucket, but you have different objects and you tag those objects with the principal tag with the common name. So even though all the sources, the servers would be using the same role, but because they all have a different CNAME as a principal tag, they will only be allowed to access those particular objects which have that principal tag on them. So it's a very good way of further refining that. So in our case, just to show you, so I do have that common name issued to me, but for the demo purposes, I will just change it to on-prem rather than server. And if I update the trust policy and go back now to see if I can access the same thing again, it should give me an error. Okay, still doing that, probably still updating in the backend. There we go. So it gives me an error because the common name on my certificate, the one issued to, is on-prem server rather than just on-prem. And to fix that, if I go back and edit that again, wait for a couple of seconds. There we go. Now I have access back.
Nice. And to echo what you're saying, the attribute-based security model in AWS is extremely powerful. We see it a lot in SaaS-based products because it's not only do you have security in the code, you also have it now in the permissions and the infrastructure level. So it's that three layers of security because if a dev accidentally forgets to add a where statement or the appropriate restrictions on the backend query, or back to AWS, then you got that extra layer what says that based on the IAM role, they can actually only see this particular data set anyway. So it gives you that three layers of security, which is really important, especially if you handle sensitive information.
Cool. What I was going to do, installs.
Why are you also doing that? Because we've been talking about all of the virtues of IAM anywhere. What are the downsides and drawbacks? Like,
Yeah, so I mean, that's a really good question, Casey. I mean, it definitely gets rid of some of your problems, but I wouldn't say all of it, right? With anything, it obviously reduces the overhead of managing IAM keys, but at the same time, it introduces a new process, which is certificates, right? So you need to now manage your certificates. But the good thing about that is if you're an enterprise, you already have most probably a certificate management process in place. So you have your private CA or you have other mechanisms of issuing certificates to your internal services, and you have that process in place to actually manage the renewal and all that. So you can, reuse the same process to manage these certificates as well. The drawbacks I see is that you still have that issue of creating more common names and creating those roles with the trust relationship where you have to, define which certificates are allowed to access which services. And the other thing is for SMBs, it can be quite difficult to manage a fully private CA and the certificate management process itself. I guess the AWS private CA does take care of some of that, but it's still again a process that you still need to manage. So it's not a silver bullet itself, but I'd see it being a lot better than using IAM keys for providing access from on-prem resources, for example. And it can be quite useful for any external third-party providers or vendors that might not have a presence in AWS, but they do want to access your AWS resources, and you can give them this mechanism where you will issue certificates to them, and they can then use those to access resources. Um, yeah, so I think those are the few things that I would say.
nice.
Cool. One thing, I mean, other good thing about this is obviously I was going to show the cloud trail. You can see then in the cloud trail on what is being used. Um, as well. One thing I did want to talk about now that we have a bit of time is AWS Certificate Manager Private CA. So I mean, as I showed that that's what I'm using, and one of the main reasons for using that is because it tightly integrates with AWS services and it's a managed service, right? So just to go through some of the features of this private CA. First of all, it's secure and a managed private CA service. And one thing you would know that it actually uses hardware security modules to take care of the encryption keys. And if you are a small organization and try to replicate that in-house or on-prem, that can get really expensive really fast. So it's better to use the service itself than actually creating your own private CAs and looking after it. Uh, Again, the SCM itself, you can manage all the certificates centrally. So these can be public as well as private certificates. So as you know, with the certificate ACM, the AWS certificate management service, certificate manager, you can use that to have manage the public certs, which can then be assigned to different AWS services like the load balancers, API gateways, or CloudFront. So it provides you that central management mechanism. Other one is enables developer agility. So imagine you have your enterprise CA, and then you set up, CI/CD pipelines for the developers to push codes really quickly. But then if they have to go and, ask your existing third party or someone or internal to go and issue a private CA, that could, take a week. So having a private CA in AWS allows you to create certificates, renew them using APIs as part of your pipelines rather than you have another process that you have to go through to do it. The other one is you have flexibility to customize certificates, so you can add additional values and properties within the private certificates that you actually issue. And I mean, lastly, which is with any other cloud service, is it's a pay-as-you-go model. So you don't need to purchase upfront. You can just pay for what you use for.
Also, if anyone has any questions in particular, not just about IAM Anywhere, but IAM in general or any other services, now is the time to throw them out there. Um, just like, yeah, because we are coming towards the end of the demo. And another one, just a shameless plug, in about 2 hours, we have another New Zealand essay presenting on getting around throttling or issues and when dealing with API gateway and SaaS-based businesses. Very interesting presentation. I have actually um, been across that presentation before when he's done it internally. It's yeah, it's very good information. And there's also going to be a demo. I'm pretty sure that's and starts in 2 hours.
Cool. Awesome. I mean, look, that's all I have from my end, but yeah, happy to answer any particular questions you might have.
Not from me. Yeah, we also see we got, oh, we got a lot of people from overseas. We've got Portugal, Brazil, everyone in that vein. That's awesome to see. And as I mentioned, yeah, just because the LinkedIn groups at AWS New Zealand is just for anyone that is really expressing interest and being a part of the New Zealand AWS community. If you want to come over here and help getting help assisting finding a job and everything like that, then yeah, we're more than happy to help out. We're a friendly bunch over in New Zealand.
Sure are, sure are.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, I mean, just going back to the topic itself on roles anywhere, I've seen a lot of enthusiasm. So anyone who I talk to in our enterprise segment, at least, they're always excited to know what it is and how to use it because everyone has got their similar issues in terms of IAM keys. And I think, Casey, you and I were discussing that. I think number one reason for compromised AWS accounts is anecdotally IAM keys, aren't they?
Yep, pretty much nearly every single compromise I have is through IAM keys that haven't been managed. And you'll be surprised that if you check in um, a key into GitHub in a public repository, I think the average time for someone to start using them is about 5 minutes.
Yeah, and I have had that in the past where some developer tried to, or well, thought they could publish some of the modules which were, just to share in the community, to put it on GitHub, and unfortunately, without them knowing, they had a config file with the keys in it, and they got published in public repository. And within 5 minutes, some bot had scraped it, logged into AWS accounts, started creating lots and lots of servers to do a lot of mining, shall we say. So yeah,
Yeah. So at the end of the day, I guess I'll just do one last PSA out there was just make sure you secure the accounts and just think security first. It's a lot easier to stop it before it happens than it is to fix it once it's happened.
Yep, that's correct. So yeah, make sure you use those conditional policies. So make sure you use the session policies. So reduce the radius in terms of blast radius and also where the users or the services are coming from. So, restrict by the IP addresses, restrict by the principal tags or CNAMEs, anything along those lines.
Awesome. I think that is the end of it. We won't drag this out any longer or anything like that because, it's always great to get the extra 10 minutes back in the day. So thank you everyone that, offered questions, interacted. It's been an awesome session. Thank you, Imran, for taking time out of your day to share this topic. I learned a lot as well, and hopefully, people on the stream also learned a lot.
Awesome. Yep. Again, thank you, Casey, for hosting me, and thank you everyone for joining and taking the time out of your day. It's definitely been entertaining. Thank you.
Awesome. Cool. See you everyone. Mati wa.
All right. Bye.